Welcome everyone to the 47th Virtual Roundtable on Measuring Corruption. I'm delighted to welcome you all, and of course to welcome our illustrious speaker today, Salvatore Polizzi, who will be discussing the topic of corruption detection based on a research that was also very recently published, right, on detecting corruption patterns in the banking sector using textual analysis. This is not the first meeting that we have on corruption detection. We have had one or two in the past. Uh, but this is something that I have felt and I continue feeling that is not sufficiently explored in connection to discussions about measurement. And it's something that when I first reached to Salvatore and we had a call, I tried to take the time to explain how exactly, at least personally, I see the topic of detection fitting within the closely connected discussion on measurement or metrics or approaches to that end, right? So I'm very happy that we are able to get the conversation here today before the end of the year. Before I invite Salvatore to tell us a little bit about himself and start sharing his screen, I would like to go over a couple of points about how the meeting will be conducted. So the majority of you, this is not the first time, but this is the first time for a few here. So of course the meeting is being recorded. This will be uploaded later. Salvatore will be presenting. There's no separation between the Q&A and the presentation itself. Rather, if you have any questions or comments about the slide or the point or idea that Salvatore is making at that point, feel free to raise your hand, either in the just waving at the camera or clicking the hand emoji, and I'll invite you to unmute yourself and participate. If this is the first time that you're participating today, please, if you could say something about your affiliation and just a quick line about your area of expertise or background so that we can work in that sense of building a little bit of a measurement of corruption network here. Otherwise, I'll ask you to make sure to keep your microphone muted throughout the meeting, unless again you have any comment or question. Just to make it easier for Salvatore to keep focus on the presentation itself. Salvatore, I apologize in advance because I will be making a lot of questions and comments because I always like further clarification just to make sure that we're all on the same page about the definitions and technical aspects of your work.
Sure. Well, feel free to interrupt me whenever it is necessary.
That's very kind of you. Thank you. Well, I'm José Pocho Alvarez, your host today. And that's it from my side. Salvatore, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Joseph. It is a real pleasure to be here. So good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, well, depending on where you are right now. Let me quickly share my screen. Okay, I suppose that you can see my presentation. Please
Yes,
let me
could
put
you
it
just
full
make it
screen.
full screen? That's right. Perfect.
Yes. Great. So it is a real pleasure to be here, and it's been a while since my last. I mean, I started focusing on the topic of corruption a few years ago, and this is one of my last co-authored paper, and it is a real pleasure to present here today. So the title of this research is Corruption Detection Through Textual Analysis, Evidence from Eurozone Banks, and it is a co-authored paper with my fantastic colleagues Rodolfo Demiano, who is also joining this webinar, Enzo Scannella and Giuseppe Valenza. We are all researchers and professors from the University of Palermo in Italy. And I would like also to remark that this project has been developed within the EUMOD Next research project, which has been funded by the European Union to focus on various different aspects related to corruption and fraud in, in Europe in general, both in the public and in the private sector. And we worked, as you can see from this presentation, in the private sector and more specifically in the banking industry. So in this paper, we tried to analyze whether we could find any early warning detection system by using textual analysis methodologies to find association with the corruption events in the banking industry, and as we shall see, also to some extent to detect in advance corruption events before of their occurrences, or to be more precise, before of the spread of the news of these corruption events through news publication websites. So just let me start with a quick overview of our paper. So the main aim is to analyze bank annual financial reports to detect bank potential involvement in corruption scandals. We rely on different types of textual analysis methodologies, and we combine them also with traditional content analysis techniques and econometric methodologies. So we use various artificial intelligence algorithms to find this association between corruption events and the textual analysis measures. So we use random forest, support vector machine, gradient boosting, and naive Bayes classifier that are amongst the most widely used artificial intelligence algorithms. And we also combine them with a more traditional and conventional econometric methodologies, which is the logistic methodology. In order to perform these textual analysis techniques, we use also various large language models, and in particular, we use FinBERT and a subsection of FinBERT, which is ESG-BERT, because as we shall see, we interpret corruption within the banking industries mainly as a governance-related issue. And therefore, within the ESG concept, so environmental, social, and governance, we identify corruption as mainly as a governance problem. And we complement also these large language models with a traditional dictionary analysis based on the vocabulary provided by Lawford and MacDonald in 2011, which is widely used in the accounting and banking literature. We analyzed a sample of 42 Eurozone banks, which span over the 2011-2022 time horizon. As you shall see, our sample is not that large compared to other banking studies, but this is related to the difficulties we encountered when it comes to the collection and the identification of corruption events. So I think that this is an important aspect, which is also particularly interesting for the audience of this webinar, given that, I mean, it is not always easy to detect corruption events. Publicly available data sets do not provide this type of information to the best of our knowledge. There are certain specific aspects in some databases focused on controversies related to governance aspects or more broadly to some fines the banks are exposed to by supervisory authorities, but not specifically to corruption, which is the main focus of our paper. So we had to manually collect a lot of data to identify these cases of corruption, and we end up with a sample of 42 Eurozone banks. Just a quick overlook about the main findings of our paper. So we find that the extent of governance-related disclosure is one of the main determinants of the probability of a bank of being involved in a corruption scandal. And we also find that the tone of the governance disclosure plays an important role. And specifically, the litigious tone plays a role, but also the negative and positive tone of governance-related disclosure seem to be associated to the probability of being involved in a corruption event in the banking industry. We achieve a remarkable level of accuracy of our corruption detection tool, well above the 50% threshold, which basically differentiate between a random selection and something that is able to actually identify corruption events. And so we achieve a 71 accuracy percentage with the gradient boosting algorithm and about 69% with the random forests. Okay, so let me start with a general discussion about the importance of corruption. Well, I know that it is quite probably it is not very useful for the audience of this paper because you are expert in corruption and you know that corruption can create a lot of problem in the economy and in the society as a whole. So there are several studies that show that corruption can undermine democracy, violates human rights, and leads to market distortions. And these can have various negative consequences on the economy, such as the disincentive for entrepreneurial investments, unequal distribution of wealth, altered composition of government expenditure. So this is particularly important, of course, for the public sector. But there are also negative consequences in the economy as a whole and in the private sector too. Just to give you an idea, according to the United Nations, according to the last estimates, approximately 5% of global GDP is destroyed just because of corruption. So even from simply a very macro economic perspective, the topic of corruption is absolutely important from an economic perspective. Corruption is also particularly relevant in the financial industry and in particular in the banking industry for several reasons. First of all, there have been several scandals related to bank corruption events that in the past have negatively impacted the functioning of the financial system. Just to give you a general idea, the the dynamics of the global financial crisis, which has been widely investigated in the banking and financial literature, are at least partially due to corruption scandals and corruption events that have affected banks and also rating agency and supervisory authorities. So basically, during the 2008-2019 global financial crisis, starting in the US, several rating agencies have been corrupted to provide some types of securitized assets, very high levels of ratings so that this asset could appear much safer whilst they were actually junk assets basically. So they were very risky, but because of these very high ratings, they were considered very safe, and investors were willing to invest in these securitized assets during the global financial crisis. Also, supervisory authorities were involved in this corruption events and banks themselves issuing these securitized assets were involved too. And this had a disruptive impact in the in the global economies, not only in the US, but also in Europe and worldwide. And this is a clear example of how corruption can have a negative impact in the society and in the economy as a whole. Other studies show that corruption has worsened the effectiveness of bank lending in several countries, and they also have a negative impact on bank performance, and they can increase the probability of a banking crisis if we just think about the reputational impact that a corruption event can have on a bank. And this is particularly important for a bank because banks are involved very often in what we call the so-called domino effect. So basically, if we have lack of trust on a single bank, this lack of trust might be transferred to other banks. So I don't trust anymore, not just that bank, but the whole banking industry as a whole. And that could have negative consequences for depositors. So as a current account holder, I don't trust my bank. I don't trust any bank anymore. And so I don't invest. I tend to hold more liquid assets, and this can have negative consequences, of course, in terms of investment and in terms of the functioning of the financial system. And this can also have important consequences in terms of financial stability, because if banks don't cannot rely on the trust of their depositors, of their stakeholders, of their current account holders, then the financial system doesn't work anymore properly, and therefore there are serious financial stability consequences of corruption events. Although this topic is very interesting and very important from a policy and theoretical perspective, it has not, surprisingly, it has not been widely discussed in the academic literature so far. I just cite here a couple of papers, but there is an interesting study by Bahu in 2020 that focused on corruption in the banking industry. And there was also a recent academic interest by some research group, and Emo Fraud is one of them. And I used to work within this research project, but just to give you an idea that it is not a topic that has been widely discussed in the literature, at least so far. So the main focus of our paper is on the relationship between corruption and bank disclosure by looking at bank annual financial reports. We can basically, one of the main underlying assumption of our paper is that a wide range of stakeholders can push banks to provide more transparency and higher levels of information regarding any potential misconduct, including, of course, corruption, and also on the effectiveness of anti-corruption systems that are in place at bank level. So just to give you a brief idea of the main stakeholders that might be interested in this type of information, we refer to current and potential investors that, of course, are interested on whether a bank can potentially be involved in a corruption event and with the negative consequences that it brings. The same for depositors, any type of lender or borrower of the bank, including other financial intermediaries. So if a bank asks for a loan to another bank, then it is an important stakeholder that it to some extent it is interested in the type of information provided regarding the effectiveness of anti-corruption systems and corruption in general. Regulators and supervisors that are also sometimes in the position to find the bank where in circumstances whether it is involved in corruption or governance-related issues. Governments are interested too, given that they might provide public funding, and so on, just to give you an idea of how many different type of heterogeneous stakeholders are interested in this type of information. There is limited academic literature also on the topic of corruption-related disclosure. There are some studies that are mostly qualitative studies based on case studies that are focused on non-financial firms. So Blank and Kowalczyk Oyer are amongst the few studies on these topics. And there is, to the best of our knowledge, one of the few studies focusing on this is the one provided by Andres and co-authors, focusing on the analysis of bank-specific and country-level determinants of corruption-related disclosure. Based on this review of the literature, we identify a gap in the extant academic literature on this topic because no study has either to identify any early warning signal that can predict
corruption that you
corruption.
know back the definition of corruption that you use.
Sure. Yeah. Well, that's a key point, and I will show you in a few slides because we noticed that the data collection has been quite explained, and we noticed that we were not always in agreement on whether an event could be considered a corruption event or not. And so we adopted a definition provided by Pellegrini in 2011 uh, in a few slides, and it is a part of, well, a key part of our collection, of our data collection process. And I will show it to you in a few seconds. So I think we can go ahead, or should we wait for Joseph? I don't know.
Yes, sorry, my
Okay.
internet jumped for a moment and I got disconnected, but I'm back.
Okay, great. We took the opportunity to provide the answer to a question from Fabiano. So
Yes, yes, I caught the last part. Thank you, Fabiano
sure.
and Salvatore for keeping the party going in my absence.
Yeah, no worries. Okay, so basically, this is the research question that we aim to answer with our paper. So, what type of early warning indicators can be computed by means of banking disclosures to detect in advance the occurrence of a banking corruption scandal? So, basically, we see both in a baseline model the relationship between a concurrent corruption scandal, and also we try to detect in advance the occurrence of a corruption scandal before of its occurrence by looking at the disclosure of the previous years. But I will show it to you better in a second when I will show you the methodology that we employ in our paper. So, just a little bit of theoretical background on the association between disclosure and corruption events. So, we argue that there are two main theoretical arguments that can explain the relationship between our textual measures and the occurrence of corruption events. First of all, the first theoretical argument is that provided by Spence in 1973, and it is the one of the signaling theory. According to this theoretical framework, banks with an effective anti-corruption systems should signal their superior performance in terms of the effectiveness of such systems. For uncorrupted banks, so banks that are not involved in such scandals, should be willing to signal that they are not involved in this type of corruption events. So based on this theoretical argument, of disclosure should be associated with lower levels of corruption. So uncorrupted banks should provide more disclosures regarding corruption in general and also with reference to their anti-corruption systems. On the other hand, there is another opposing theoretical argument, which is the one provided by Goffman in 1949 within the framework of the impression management theory. According to this theory, banks with ineffective anti-corruption systems should attempt to manipulate stakeholder perceptions. And therefore, banks that are actually involved in corruption events, so corrupted banks, conceive the impression that they will not be involved in a corruption scandals. And they can do so by providing higher levels of disclosure and trying to show that they are more transparent, even though they are actually trying to hide their potential involvement in corruption scandals or their ineffectiveness of their anti-corruption systems. So, according to this opposing theoretical view, high levels of disclosure should be observed for corrupted banks. So, trying to understand which of these two theories is the most prominent one is basically an empirical question that we cannot provide just by simply proposing a theoretical argument. And so we need an empirical analysis to provide an answer to try to understand which of the two theories is the most useful one for our research context. And so we will try to understand which of these two theories wins. These are the three main research hypotheses of our paper. And basically, we start from a quite general first research hypothesis related to the association between present and past disclosure and corruption event. More specifically, we argue that governance-related disclosure in our second research hypothesis is associated to corruption event because corruption is generally considered within the banking industry as mainly as a governance-related problem. And by looking at the tone of this disclosure, we also try to hypothesize an association between the tone. We shall see that litigious tone plays a prominent role. So the tone of governance-related disclosure and corruption events. So this is our third research hypothesis. So just to give you a brief visual inspection of our research hypothesis, so Generally, we think that disclosure has an association with the probability of corruption, more specifically, governance-related disclosure, and more specifically, once again, the tone of governance-related disclosure. They should have an impact on the probability of corruption. So now let me quickly describe our data collection process, which is probably the most painful part of our research, but also very interesting, I must admit. So we try to retrieve information regarding corruption events by analyzing, by searching for corruption event news in a wide range of reputable economic and financial newspapers at European levels. So just to provide a few examples, we analyze Reuters, Financial Times, The Economist, so some of the most important news publication websites and most reputable ones. To double check that the information we collected was actually trustworthy, we also used a database which is Nexis Uni, which provides information at aggregated level of news coverage. And we double checked that the information that we collected were also reported on this database, and to double check that the information we collected was actually true and trustworthy. During this data collection process, we realized that we needed a definition of corruption because I remember having a chat with Rodolfo or with Giuseppe, and sometimes we were not in full agreement whether we could consider a bank actually involved in a corruption scandal or not. So we thought that adopting a definition of corruption could be something that could help us in solving this type of problems. So, given that, I mean, most of the definition that we found were mostly related to the public sector, we tried to find a definition which was general enough also to be included, to be considered also in the private sector and therefore also in the banking industry. And therefore, we used this definition provided by Pellegrini in 2011. But I won't read the whole definition because it is quite long, but basically it is based on the misuse of entrusted power for private gain. And so this is pretty much in line with the aim of our paper and with our focus on the financial industry. And it includes various types of behaviors such as bribery, nepotism, misappropriation, and so on. So based on this exact definition, we managed to identify 21 cases of corruption in the Eurozone, and we found an agreement on these 21 cases. And we complement this sample of what we call corrupted banks, so banks for which we have confirmed news about their potential involvement in a corruption event, with a comparable sample of 21 banks that are from the Eurozone that are not involved, that have not been involved in corruption events, so that we can compare the behavior of banks involved in corruption events and banks not involved in corruption events. And so in total, we have a sample of 42 banks. 21 of them are corrupted and 21 of them are not corrupted, in the sense that, I mean, there is a news about their involvement in a corruption event. There's a question, I think, from Joseph. Please.
Yes. Thank you, Salvatore. And please, if any of this point is made later in the next following slide, just you can tell me to wait. But I had two questions. The first one relates to data collection. And I was wondering if your team discussed the inclusion of, for example, earning statements, the quarterly or the regular ones, and other forms of official financial disclosure. And the reason why I'm asking about this is because news, for example, about the performance or updates from financial institutions, as well as for any other business organization, they very much, of course, review these financial statements that are regularly produced. But because they have been pre-processed by a news agency, I wonder if the potential loss of new ones in terms of the way that certain aspects of their performance is being presented, it has an impact on the analysis. I was wondering how the decision of focusing specifically on newspapers it was reached. So I have a second question, but I wouldn't like to combine the two.
Mhm. Yeah, well, actually, our decision to focus on the newspaper publication website was probably well based on the fact that we thought that it could be the most straightforward way to collect information regarding, especially given that we are focusing on the banking industry.
Mm.
We are not just related on the actual involvement of a corruption event. We are also interested on the spread of this news and also on the potential negative consequences in terms of reputation. Basically, especially for investors, at the end of the day, I mean, it's probably something that it is not nice, but at the end of the day, I think it is like this. If a bank is involved in a corruption scandal and nobody knows about it, from an investor perspective, it doesn't make a huge impact, Because, I mean, if nobody knows about it, there is no reputational impact. And at the end of the day, I'm not interested in it from a pure financial perspective. Of course, from an ethical and moral perspective, it can have a huge impact. But let's say, as a investor just interested in money, I'm not interested in this. Okay, given that we have the perception of mostly investors that are interested in the annual financial reports, we are more interested in the spread of the news of a corruption event. Okay, so we don't even know whether the bank is actually guilty of that corruption event, because just providing information of the potential involvement of that bank in a corruption event is something that can have a negatively reputational impact, and then we are interested in analyzing the consequences and the reaction in terms of disclosure. So this is why we decided to focus on this. Of course, I mean, we cannot say that, I mean, for short, we define our banks as corrupted and uncorrupted, but we cannot actually say that they are actually corrupted. And of course, within our uncorrupted sample, we cannot guarantee that all of them are actually uncorrupted and never been involved in a corruption event that has not yet become public domain. So perhaps in a few years, we can double check whether there is any news about these 21 uncorrupted banks and check whether they were actually uncorrupted or not. But our decision to focus on the news publication websites, looking at generalistic, news publications, is related to the fact that we want to know whether these news are public domain and investors can rely on this information and check whether there is any impact on the reputation of the bank.
I see. Thank you. That clarifies it. It's important then to appreciate the fact that the spread of the information about corrupt events is part of the, let's say, the research approach itself, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Eh, so this brings me to the second question, I guess, to a certain degree. Because it's very useful that you provide a specific definition of corruption as adopted by the research team. And I wonder if it was at any point difficult to establish what a corruption event news was to begin with, right? So to what degree does corruption or a case of corruption need to feature in the news article to be selected? Uh, because I assume that when identifying a scandal, right, a case of corruption as reported by the news, potentially we may have a short tail at the beginning in which there's some situation that is being investigated or is raising eyebrows in terms of the connection between the organization and either a public official or an individual or another organization. You know what I mean? So some suspicion that something may be going on, but without necessarily identifying yet that this is a case of corruption, the specific label coming later. So would these type of articles be included? I wonder about the protocols for selection of corruption event news in this sense.
Hmm. Yeah, I totally buy your point. You're totally right. But the problem is that, I will show you in a few seconds, but basically, because of the machine learning algorithm that we use, and also because of the conventional econometric technique that we use, we are already in trouble with such a small sample, because generally I'm used to analyze sample of hundreds of thousands of banks, and then econometric techniques are powerful enough to identify patterns. So grouping all together these 21 banks without differentiating whether they are, I mean, involved for sure in a corruption event or whether there is any suspicious, basically for our quantitative analysis, this is the best we can do. We could have also separated between, I mean, suspicious events or events for which we have um, an exact economic impact of the corruption event. I mean, we also could collect some data on the economic impact or on the financial impact and so on. But this is something that we could not do in a quantitative analysis, grouping them all together. So we were already in trouble trying to differentiate between, the corruption within such a small sample. And this is something that we could not do, unfortunately. But this is a good point and a good idea. We are also working on trying to enlarge our sample. We are a little bit in trouble on that. But perhaps using a global sample with a larger number of banks could be a good idea also, and something statistically feasible to analyze also this relationship between suspicious and actual corruption events.
Right.
So, I mean, this is probably one of the main methodological limitation of our paper, but this is the best that we can do, unfortunately.
Of course, right. No, no, that's completely fair, and thank you for again clarifying, because I think that is very important for everybody to really appreciate that data constraints in terms of number of cases that one has worked that is working with. That spills over into methodological decisions and in terms of how we analyze these kind of things, right? Um,
Yeah.
so of course we work with limitations that you mentioned, and even though yeah there are some ideas that can be thrown around, at the end of the day we're working with this amount of data, and that's what it is, right?
Yeah.
Thank you for the clarification, Salvatore.
No, no. Thank you for the question. Yeah. At the end of the day, we thought it was a good idea to analyze this topic because, I mean, it's very rare to find this type of studies in the literature, also because of these data constraints. So we decided to do the best that we could do with our available data. So, of course, there are limitations, but this is the best that we could do. Okay, so let me go ahead. Okay, so we included in our sample so these corrupted and uncorrupted banks that are included in the ICON database, which provide information on financial statement, corporate governance, and also environmental, social, and governance data. And we also included in our sample just banks that provide an official English and audited version of their annual financial reports, so for comparability purposes. We also include in our sample country level and macroeconomic variables that have been collected from the World Development Indicator database provided by the World Bank. And we manually collected the financial reports from the bank official websites. And so we selected also these 21 comparable banks based on the size and on the location on the Eurozone to compare them with the behavior of the 21 corrupted banks that we identified in our sample. When it comes to the textual methodology, we rely on the content analysis methodological framework proposed by Krippendorf to conduct an automated textual analysis of the annual financial reports. And specifically, we extracted the sentences that are associated to governance topics by using FIM-BERT and ESG-BERT, so especially the G component of ESG-BERT. Once again, this is because corruption is a typical corporate governance problem. And we also measure the tone of such governance-related sentences by using the dictionary approach proposed by Lawford and MacDonald. So simply based on the count of occurrences of certain positive, negative, and litigious words, we can estimate the level of litigiousness, positiveness, and negativeness of these governance-related disclosures. As I already explained, we use conventional statistical techniques, specifically the logistic methodologies widely used in the banking literature, and more innovative machine learning methodologies. Just to give you a quick overlook of the logistic estimation that we use, we try to estimate the impact on the probability of being involved in a corruption event. So our main dependent variable is this indicator variable corrupt, which is equal to 1 if a bank I located in country J is involved in a corruption scandal after time t and 0 otherwise. So basically it differentiates between uncorrupted and corrupted banks, identifying corrupted banks after the spread of the news of this corruption event. And we regress this variable over our main variables of interest. The main one is the governance text score, which is the percentage of governance-related sentences as classified by Fin and DSG BERT, and also the tone of these disclosures, so positive, negative, and litigious tone, as suggested by Lawford and MacDonald. And we also include other factors that can have an impact on the level of corruption. So we just include them as control variables. So we include bank level characteristics, such as the size, the level of capitalization, profitability, and the ESG score, and also corporate governance characteristics, such as board size and board gender diversity. We also include country level characteristics, so regulatory quality, GDP, and so on. And to ensure a level of comparability between this logistic regression and the machine learning methodology, we merge all together bank level characteristic, corporate governance characteristics, and also country level characteristics in one single component by using principal component analysis. This is a necessary step to ensure that there is a high level of comparability because of the constraint of the logistic model, which we cannot include too many variables because the sample is quite small. So we need to collapse all of these variables together. And we could not exploit also the what we call the panel data structure of our data in the machine learning algorithms. So we can just compare 2 different years, so 1 year before the scandal and 1 year after in the machine learning methodology. And so because of this constraint, the best we could do is just to collapse these variables all together and to estimate their impacts on an aggregated level. This is a list of all of the control variables that we used. So we merged together all the balance sheet variables, ESG, and macro country level variables by using principal component analysis. So collapse them all together. And of course, we keep separated our main variables of interest. So the governance related disclosure and the tone of this disclosure. Another question, I think, Joseph, please.
Yes, thank you, Salvatore. I just wanted to take a moment and ask you if you could perhaps go a little more into detail about this idea of comparing 1 year before, 1 year after the corruption scandal, right? And I'm particularly interested in let's say the premise or the logic involved of selecting those t minus one, t plus one, because of course we are working at two levels of abstraction, right? So on the one hand, we have banks that have been engaging in corrupt activities, right? And disclosed, right? Until at one moment they become disclosed, and then we're looking at a corruption scandal, right?
Mhm.
So, but we don't know right now for how long they've been involved in corruption, right? So I wonder if there is a discussion that took place in among the research members in terms of how to address the separation between the statements before and after a corruption scandals when we don't know for how long the corruption activity have been going on, in terms of finding this reflected in their financial statements. Would it make sense to also look at T minus two or T minus three, like, or is T minus one, let's say, a close estimate that is sufficient for the point of the study?
Mhm. That's a good point. Once again, it is related to the limitation of our data set. So I will show you in a few moments, but basically, um, so first of all, there is a methodological constraint because I really like logistic model because I mean they are conventional statistical techniques and they allows us to exploit as much as possible the panel data structure of our data. So as you can see here, we have corruption at times t, okay? And so we can play here with t minus 1, t minus 2, and we can do whatever we want with this logistic regression. But unfortunately, based on our analysis, the logistic model doesn't work very well, or at least it works much worse compared to machine learning algorithms. With machine learning algorithms, we cannot exploit the panel structure of our data. So we can just compare two different years. Okay. So when we compare years, I mean, corruption event occurred in times t with the disclosure at time t, then we can use the full sample. But when we go 1 year before, we lose some observations because based on our sample period, no, which is from, sorry. Yeah, I missed our sample period. I think there was a slide showing the sample period, if I remember correctly.
Yes, towards the beginning,
Yeah,
2011,
probably at the beginning. Yeah.
2021, if I'm not
Yeah.
mistaken,
Yeah.
2022.
2011, 2022. Right. So I don't remember exactly, but I think five or six of these corruption scandals occurred in 2011. And so if we go 1 year before, we lose 5, 6 banks. And it is already a tragedy for our sample because it is already quite small. In addition, we need information regarding the year before, given that we want to analyze also the impact of our other variables at country level and at bank level. And unfortunately, Icon is not very helpful on this side because they provide information regarding the 10 previous years. They are quite rich, but with the previous years, there are a lot of missing data and so we lose other banks. So if we could want to do it with T minus 2 or T minus 3 with our machine learning methodologies, we will end up with 4 or 5 banks. And so it wouldn't make sense. And so once again, the best we could do is 1 year before with the machine learning methodology. We could play a little bit with the logistic regression, exploiting the panel structure, but it doesn't perform as well as the machine learning methodology. So unfortunately, this is the best that we could do.
Thank you. That I mean that's very helpful because it gives us an idea of what could be on the horizon moving forward, right? Or
Yeah.
what are the possibilities with a larger sample.
Yeah, I mean,
That's very helpful as
creating
well.
creating a data set with worldwide coverage with a largest time span would be really fantastic I think for a corruption scholar or for a banking scholar, for any scholar, I think so.
Sure, sure.
Yeah,
Thank you. Just as a parenthesis, so I love to have the conversation and learn these things because very often we miss a lot of the things that were left on the table that didn't make into the paper. But of course, because not everything can make it into the paper, right? So one of the
sure.
points of the roundtable is to be able to discuss with the author about these kind of the details of how it actually was the process of conducting the research in a friendlier environment, if you will. So thank you.
Yeah, yeah. Well, in the paper we wrote that this is one of the main limitations of the paper. Of course, we could not go into the detail, but it is a good opportunity. Also, well, as in terms of corruption measurement and detection, this is a key aspect. Also, the problems in data collection is probably the reason why this strand of literature is not so developed so far. So very, very important aspect, definitely. Okay, so these are the variables that we include in the model, and now let me jump to the results. So we show the confusion matrix here of the various machine learning methodologies that we use. And this is our baseline estimation, so in which we compare the corruption event at times t with the disclosure at times t. So without any early detection, we just see whether banks involved in a corruption scandal at time t provide lower or higher levels of disclosure and try to understand whether the algorithm can identify banks that are corrupted and uncorrupted. So basically, here the 0 indicates that banks are not corrupted and 1 that the bank is corrupted, whilst in the other axis, the 0 means that the software has identified the bank as uncorrupted. And so 0, 0 means that these 14 banks have been correctly identified as uncorrupted, whilst 1, 0 and 0, 1 are false positive and false negative, basically. Whilst 1, 1 means that these 15 banks have been correctly identified as actually corrupted. So we can see that some of these machine learning algorithm performs quite well. So random forest in particular achieves an accuracy of 69%, which is quite good also compared to what we can find in the literature. And the best one appears to be the gradient boosting machine learning algorithm, which achieves an accuracy of 71%. We can also try to, use this machine learning algorithm for predictive purposes. So comparing the level of disclosure of the year before with a corruption that has occurred the year after. So corruption at time t and disclosure at times t minus 1. Of course, the level of accuracy decreases as we could expect, but still the random forest and gradient boosting still performs quite well with a 65% of accuracy. So even though, these algorithms are not perfect, they are still capable of identifying the majority of corruption events. And so we think that this result is quite interesting and potentially helpful. Of course, we can just check whether there is a estimated high level of probability of being involved in a corruption event by looking at the disclosure of the year before, and then we can double check, of course, based on other characteristics. In this graph, we show the SHAP values of the variable importance of and we start with the baseline estimation. So the SHAP values basically can be interpreted as the level of statistical significance of the variables that we introduce in our model. So with the logistic regression, it is quite easy to compute the so-called p-value that to some extent give us an idea of the statistical importance of that variable in explaining the probability of being involved in a corruption event. But unfortunately, we cannot do that with machine learning methodologies because they are like black boxes and we don't know exactly the impact of each of these variables in influencing the level of the probability of corruption. This is something that is pretty much at the frontier of the research, and recently some statistical researchers provide this SHAP value methodology to estimate it's not a statistical significant per se, but it is a level of feature importance. To some extent, they give us an idea of which of these variables is more important in explaining and in providing information on the probability of a corruption of a bank, basically. So something similar to statistical significance, but it is not exactly that. So we can see that, of course, our control variables play an important role. So we can see in the left part, in the left-hand part of this figure, that the accounting variables play an important role. country level variables also play an important role, but the third most important variable is the percentage of governance sentences. Also, litigious tone seems to play an important role, and other variables turns out to be less important. On the right-hand part of this chart, we show the so-called beesworm plot. And let me explain to you what it is by looking at this country PCA. So we can notice that these yellow points on the right part of the chart are, you see, the feature value is high. So it means that the level of country principal component analysis is quite high. And on the right part, we have the banks that are corrupted. Okay, so banks that have a high level of country PCA are the ones that are involved in corruption events, whilst the one on the left, you can see they are characterized by, purple or red colors, so their feature value is low, and they are mostly concentrated in the area of the uncorrupted banks. Okay, and so by looking at this graph, we can see whether, let's say, this variable has a negative or a positive impact on the probability of being involved in a corruption event. Once again, with the logistic model, it's very easy. We see the sign of the regression parameter. If it is positive, the impact is positive. If it is negative, negative. In this case, we don't have something like this, unfortunately. So the beesworm approach is the best that we could do to understand whether the impact is positive or negative. We're not really interested in this PCA, in this country PCA, but I wanted to show you because it is quite easy to understand. We're mostly interested in this percentage of governance sentences. The pattern is not as clear as the country PCA, but we can see that high levels of this feature value are concentrated on the right part, whilst lower levels are concentrated on the left part. Okay. Of course, I mean, not as clear as the country PCA, but there is an effect. And so basically, this shows that banks that provide more levels of governance-related disclosure tend to be more involved in corruption events, whilst banks that don't provide this type of information or provide less type of governance-related sentences are less involved in a corruption event. This is in line with our hypothesis related to the impression management, because we could expect that banks that are not corrupted, that can rely on reliable anti-corruption mechanism, could provide a high level of disclosure compared to the signaling theory. But this is in contrast to what we find, so it is more in line with impression management theory. So actually, corrupted banks are the ones that try to be more, that let's say they pretend to be more transparent. They provide more information, okay, regarding their governance-related disclosure. But this does not mean that they are less involved in a corruption events, but they are actually involved in these corruption events. And the same pattern, more or less, can be observed when it comes to the litigious tone. So higher level of litigious tones is provided by uncorrupted banks, and this is unsurprising because corrupted banks are the ones that should adopt a more litigious tone because they might probably be involved in legal issues or they can go to the court because of this corruption involvement. But they are the ones that provide less information regarding this. And so once again, this is in line with an impression management strategy provided by this bank. The pattern is different when it comes to the graded boosting estimation, because, I mean, just to clarify, this is the baseline random forest estimation. So corruption at times t, disclosure at times t for random forest. This is corruption at times t, disclosure at times t for graded boosting. The pattern is slightly different. In this case, the positive tone seems to be a more prominent role, but once again, this is in line with the impression management theory because a more positive tone is adopted by corrupted banks. And once again, this is surprising because they should be more negative and more worried about their involvement in a corruption event. When it comes to the predicting random forest estimation, as we can see, the number of points in our beesworm plot is lower because we lose some observation by looking at the year before. But once again, the results are pretty much in line with the impression management theory when it comes to the litigious tone, which is the second most important feature in our in this machine learning algorithm. And when it comes to gradient boosting, the negative tone seems to be the most important variable. But once again, it can be interpreted as uh, an impression management strategy, given that higher level of negative tones are associated to uncorrupted banks, which is exactly the opposite that we could expect by relying on a signaling theory perspective. Now, let me jump to the conclusions. So, in this paper, we analyzed the relationship between disclosure and corruption events in the banking industry. We use both advanced machine learning algorithms, so random forest, gradient boosting, and so forth, and conventional econometric techniques, so logistic regression. And we combine them with advanced large language models based on artificial intelligence, so basically FinBERT and DSGBERT, with conventional dictionary approaches like the one proposed by Lofran and MacDonald. We provide robust evidence of the association between disclosure and corruption events. And we also find support to our main research hypothesis regarding the association between disclosure, more specifically governance-related disclosure, and the tone of this disclosure, and the probability of being involved in a corruption event. And we also show that the disclosure measure can play an important role in detecting an association and even to some extent predicting bank corruption events. And we achieve a noticeable predictive power of our machine learning estimations. Our results are mostly in line with impression management theory proposed by Goffman, in that corrupted banks are less transparent when it comes to governance-related matters and use a less litigious tone to divert stakeholders' attention. And we think that our paper has important theoretical but also policy and managerial implications, because financial supervisors might even benefit from our corruption detection tool. Just to give you an idea, within the so-called ECAP, which is the internal capital adequacy assessment process that banks um, must compute and must carry out, and supervisors should check the effectiveness of this computation. Um, we can think of the use of this detection tool by supervisors to demand banks that to include the impact of reputational risk related to corruption scandal if the probability of being involved in a corruption event is relatively high. So, thank you very much for attending this presentation. I leave you my email address if you want to reach out, and I'm very happy to listen to any other question or comment you might have.
Thank you so much, Salvatore. That was wonderful. Could I ask you to stop sharing your screen so we can open the
Sure.
floor?
Yeah, just a moment. Am I still sharing my screen?
Yes. I think I can solve that
Okay.
for you
Oh,
from here. Let me see.
okay.
Uh,
Okay,
okay,
fine.
there it is. Yes.
Great.
Um, ah, we have already a question. David, go ahead, please.
Okay. Thank you very much for the presentation. It's quite very, illuminating. My questions is about the title of the presentation suggests is something to go around textual analysis, but I can see there are methodological preferences around going machine learning. And then given also that there are only 21 cases, so I would have thought that probably if you provide some additional textual analysis could give some additional insights into how this is studied. So I just want to know what informs why you decided to go fully into showing it much more in a much more quantitative machine learning way rather than to show kind of textual analysis of the corruption cases.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your question. Well, perhaps I did not remark very well this aspect in the presentation, but I mean, we think that the main distinctive and the contribution of our paper is mostly related to the use of FINBERT and ESGBERT to identify the governance-related disclosures, and we also use the dictionary approach proposed by Lawford and MacDonald to measure the tone of such disclosures. So basically, thanks to this large language model, which is basically an advanced text analysis technique, we are able to identify the governance-related disclosure in a much quicker fashion compared to what we could do manually. I mean, our sample is quite small, so we could do it to some extent, but just to give you an idea, there are some banks that whose financial reports is over 1,000 pages. So manually analyzing this data would be a nightmare. Fortunately, thanks to my colleague, well, especially Rodolfo is our machine learning expert, and thanks to these algorithms, we could easily detect these sentences. And so we can measure the percentage of this sentence over the total number of sentences of the annual report. And in addition, we can measure the tone of this disclosure by using a conventional text analysis technique provided by Lawford and MacDonald by counting. It's quite a simple technique. It is just based on the count of a dictionary of words provided by Lawford and MacDonald of positive, negative, and litigious words within these governance-related sentences. And we can, to some extent, check the level of positiveness or litigiousness of such disclosures. So this is we think it is quite innovative aspect because to the best of our knowledge, this is not something that it is very often done in the literature. And we also show that these aspects significantly improve the performance of our model in detecting these events. And so this is why we gave the paper this textual analysis flavor, let's say. I totally agree with, I mean, by reading this paper, we would expect more corruption cases. It would be fantastic to do that. I'm still working on this topic with my colleagues and with other colleagues. But believe me, it's really a nightmare to collect data and to, as I was already mentioning.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I just think it could be much more beneficial generally if you can have results around showing the nature of I'm sorry, the nature of the type of corruption that is common within the zone itself, whether they are transnational in nature, whether they are not, just basic descriptive, stuff about the corruption cases. Then, that could actually feed into the result that you later presented.
Okay, see your point. Yeah. Yeah, well, we provide some descriptive statistics in the paper. I can share the paper with you if you want. But of course, I mean, I think that even a very simple descriptive analysis by looking at, I mean, which countries mostly characterized by corruption, the countries that are less affected by it, and so on, could be an interesting aspect. But of course, once again, this is related to our data limitations. So even though most of our corrupted banks are from a specific country, we cannot say that that country is necessarily more corrupted than other. Perhaps it is just related to the wider spread of news of these corruption events. But yeah, I totally agree that more in-depth focus on the descriptive statistic will definitely be helpful. So thank you very much for your comment.
Fabiano?
Well, first of all, congratulations, Salvatore. I think, as you mentioned, this is uh, a field that is understudied, so you are definitely contributing to greater understanding. Um, just one comment and one question. At as a former journalist and a journalist by training, I'm happy to see that news media are very important. But on the other hand, I'm saddened to see that there aren't that many news reports. So probably if we had, um, if journalism weren't in this business model crisis, probably there would be more journalists covering the banking industry and possibly more news pieces, and as a consequence, more data for you to analyze. So this is just a call for let's help journalism thrive again. But I and my question is a little bit about that because I am curious about your conclusion. Was one sentence you wrote in your last slide, the very last slide, about um, the more corrupt the corrupt banks, they are less transparent when in governance related matters. That's what is written there. So can you clarify that, please? What do you mean by less transparent? Because I was having another impression that they were putting more information available.
Yes, well, actually, you're right. It's a typo. It's exactly the
Ah,
opposite. Yeah,
okay.
I I showed in the result that it is exactly the opposite. So basically,
Ah,
um, corrupted
they
banks
are more
provide more.
transparent,
Yeah, yeah. Let's
quote
say
to
they
quote.
provide more governance-related disclosure. Yeah, it's a
Ah,
typo.
okay.
Yeah, I
Okay,
mean,
all right. No, no, I
it's
understand. And I
probably
have to
yeah.
say that I have to say that this is in the literature in the anti-corruption literature I am aware of. Maybe Joseph can correct me. There are a few similar findings, right? So in a way that maybe when you pretend to be more transparent, actually you are bringing more confusion than clarity, and
Yeah,
so yeah, so
yeah,
that's another very interesting finding about the
yeah,
relationship between transparency, disclosure, and anti-corruption.
yeah,
So congrats
yeah.
again.
No, this is probably related to the fact that, I mean, at the beginning, I was expecting the signaling theory to play a more prominent role because, I mean, this is what we would like to
Mhm.
see, no? Right? But
Yes.
unfortunately, it is not what we find. So,
Yeah,
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 sorry
yeah.
for this type of. And also, well,
No, but yeah. No, no, go ahead. Sorry.
let me also tell you that about this your this call for more journalism news, I just wanted to clarify another key aspect. Actually, when we started searching for this news, we find many more than 21 corruption events. But unfortunately, we have also constraints when it comes to the databases that we use. So we match our data with World Bank data, with ICON, so providing corporate governance data and so on. And so unfortunately, we meet some of these banks for which we do not have accounting data, corporate governance data, or country level data that we want to use in our regression model. And so, of course, we need more news. So I definitely agree with you with reference to this call for more news regarding corruption events. But unfortunately, we could not use all of these corruption events because of our data constraints with the
Ah,
other
okay.
databases that
Good.
we use.
And do you remember the amount of new species approximately? I mean, do you have
Well,
hundreds or thousands?
no, no. Well, actually, I don't have data about this because I just know that there are some of these news that we could not take into account. But of course, our research, the search of this news was quite aimed to identify the ones that we were interested by looking at the names of the banks in our database. So
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
we were looking for some of these banks and we rejected them afterwards because we had too many missing data for
Mm-hmm.
for
I
the variables that
understand.
we used. But perhaps there are many more banks that are not included in our original database, and we don't have any idea
Yeah.
whether
Yeah.
they are involved or not. Actually, I
Yeah.
was working on other papers on corruption, and I know for sure that there are a lot of Italian small banks that are not covered in ICON, and they have been involved in corruption events, and there are news publication websites talking about this, but we
Hmm.
could not include them in our sample.
Okay, right. So just one last comment, maybe for future research, and that's for all of us. The model of disclosure, right? So maybe the way that they are disclosing is not bringing too much clarity. Perhaps a few structured disclosure model, maybe mandatory central banks. I don't know. I'm now just thinking out loud. The role of transparency disclosure on that. Thanks again.
Uh,
Thank you very much. Yeah.
we have a couple of questions in the chat as well, but I would like to fit in a quick one before reading out loud their comments and questions. Um, I wonder if I'm interpreting correctly the results of your paper when thinking about something that could be also explored building on it. Because if let's say we adopt this main variable that you identify, right? Percentage of governance statements or sentences, correct? Litigiousness and a negative tone, right? Um, if we were to, let's say, randomly select one or a few of the banks that were selected as the corrupt banks for the study, yes, and we go back in time to review, to analyze the text of their financial statements, looking for this percentage of sentences and the tone and so on and so forth, I wonder if we would find potentially a change over time that would overlap with what we later learned about the corrupt activity that the bank was engaging in, if that makes sense. Um,
Sorry, Joseph, I think I didn't get your question.
yes, okay, so this is what I'm thinking, right? Eh, because the findings are used to support the hypothesis that when a bank is involved in a corruption activity, they tend to kind of like change the way that they present their statement, their financial results, right?
Yeah.
In terms of focusing more on governance, kind of like wanting to look cleaner than they actually do, right? A more
Yep.
positive tone, etc., etc. Yes, but because a corruption activities, we cannot expect that they were going on like forever, right? We must assume that at some point the corruption activities began. Potentially, I know that if we're talking about some companies, corruption is very much embedded in them, but
Hmm.
so I wonder if we could identify a change in the patterns of these financial statements by looking at how this percentage of governance related sentences vary from year to year
Hmm. I
toward
see.
the discovery of the scandal. And if we were
Hmm.
to do that, if this change in speech in the financial statements would overlap with what we later learned about the case of corruption,
Hmm.
if
Yeah,
that makes sense.
I got it. I see your point. Yeah, it's definitely an interesting question. But I mean, when it comes to the most adequate methodology to do that, it is quite complicated. Because we could do it with a logistic regression, because in our logistic regression, we can include the whole sample period, so from 2011 to 2021, and we can check whether there is I don't know, let's say a break-even point in which the disclosure changes completely and it is associated to a less corrupt behavior by banks and something like this. So this is something we could do with logistic regression. We could do it easily. But unfortunately, logistic regression doesn't perform very well here in our model. So what we could do, the best that we could do here is try to work a little more on the logistic regression, perhaps excluding or including other variables to check whether we can achieve a higher level of accuracy. And then we can play a little bit with the data to find whether there is such a type of pattern. But right now we can't do that with machine learning methodologies, because with machine learning we can just compare two different years.
Right.
I think that there are some statistical methodology scholars that are trying to work on a panel machine learning approach that could take into account this change, and analyze larger time horizons.
Mm.
Okay. But to the best of my knowledge, we can't do that right now with the the current methodological constraints that we have with machine learning methodologies. So I was talking about that with my co-author Rodolfo. It would have been fantastic. Well, I'm not an expert of machine learning approach, but when I was talking to Rodolfo, I told him, okay, let's use a panel structure for this machine learning and let's go ahead. And he told me, well, we can do that. Nobody has never done it um, so far, not even statistical experts. And that was quite stunned. I mean, it's unbelievable. It's something that we easily do with the conventional statistical techniques and not with machine learning. But apparently this is the case, so we need to wait for not from, I think this is not something that I can do, but some statistical methodologists could help us develop in this aspect. But we probably need a few years to advance
Oh
in
wow,
this field
that's so
before.
interesting. The idea that you the let's say this line of research and your team and the fantastic activities that you're engaged in means that we're basically just waiting for the tools to catch up to what we want to do, correct?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That's so interesting,
So
Fabiano.
this is not my fault, unfortunately. It's statistical methodologists' fault. So we should blame them. We probably need to wait a few years.
Ah, so Fabiano, it's because I saw your hand earlier. Oh, okay. Uh, we also had a question from August and Dr. Akin in the chat. I guess also pointing out to a follow-up study that could build on these findings, and he's wondering if you had considered administering anonymized surveys to support the research findings. And I would here include maybe some other qualitative approach via interviews or something else to see because the results are also connected to this one of the paradigms, right? The signaling theory, which of course would be used to explain why the findings look the way they are, right? This idea of, oh, corrupt banks are more interested in looking, trying to look this way, and that's why we find this higher percentage of government centered. Is this something that could potentially lead us in a more qualitative or in a very different approach? Is that something that you have considered?
Mhm. Well, actually, most of my research in the past has been based on quantitative approaches. So I'm not an expert in qualitative analysis. I know some colleagues that are involved in such a type of analysis, and I know that, I mean, they're quite complicated and you need an expertise on this. So probably this is something that I cannot do on my own. Also, my colleague Rodolfo is mostly focused on quantitative approaches. Actually, another colleague, Giuseppe Valenza, is also in the past he also developed some qualitative analysis. So perhaps we might talk to him. But one of the constraints, it's that I'm working on a survey with other colleague on a totally different topic, and I mean, achieving a sufficient response rate is a nightmare. I mean, it's my first experience with survey data, and I must admit it's a nightmare. And I'm very happy that I'm managing these data constraints here I'm talking to you about rather than you know, suffering because of lack of responses. But I mean, this is something that we can definitely do, and I think from a theoretical perspective, it will be something very important to dig deeper on the impact of signaling and impression management, because I think in general, well, impression management seems to play a more prominent role, but we cannot reject the idea that signaling plays a role, because I mean, for some banks, it might be very important. In certain circumstances, it might be more important than others. and probably qualitative analysis could be something useful to carry out, to dig deeper. But this is something that probably I cannot do it on my own, and I need the support from other qualitative methodology experts. So
Yeah, no,
perhaps
that's
good
very
idea for
fair,
future collaboration.
I second your opinion about administering service with difficult populations to access. It is a
It's a mess.
nightmare indeed. Um,
Yeah,
we also
but this,
have
I mean,
a couple of
this,
I guess comments or questions from Lina in the chat. I understand them more as ideas for a future paper, potentially with a larger data set, because she's pointing out the importance of being able to perform more descriptive analysis of the types of corruption, potentially, separating or classifying the cases of corruption by, whether it involve fraud or bribery or embezzlement, something like that. I echo that idea that potentially the type of corruption may also be reflected in the approach to crafting those financial statements. And the second one that she mentions is potentially also considering different levels of press freedom and reporting on corruption in different countries or regions, or potentially also the requirements for financial reporting in different parts of the world. Uh, I know that we are at the very end of today's session, but allow me to convert this last point into a question, because you mentioned that you included as a control variable a PCA of the country level variables, right? Is freedom of the press and similar variables included in that PCA?
no, it is not included. That's a good idea. It's something that we could add. But well, broadly speaking, I think that given that we are focusing on Eurozone countries, the level of press freedom should be, let's say, there are differences, of course, but the level of similarity should be quite high compared to, I don't know, completely far away countries from the Eurozone. But this is something that definitely could be added in our paper. I mean, especially given that our main analysis is based on news publication websites. So this is something that
Yeah.
could play a role, definitely. And perhaps this could be one of the variables causing, an omitted variable bias that does not allow us to perform well when it comes to our logistic regression. So perhaps adding this variable could improve the accuracy of the logistic regression, and then we could play a little bit more with the data, following also your suggestions and suggestions of the other participants of this webinar. So very, very interesting and food of thought for me and for my colleagues. So thanks a lot.
I fully agree indeed. For the Eurozone, I guess freedom of the press is not such an issue. Now I'm thinking in terms of Asia, freedom of the press, yeah, it varies so wildly from country to country that I imagine it
Uh,
would need to be incorporated into a country level or selection of country level control variables. So yeah, that's very
mhm.
interesting. Thank you, Lina, as well. All right, so we've reached the end of our session in terms of time. Salvatore, I would like to thank you again for a wonderful presentation. Such an interesting topic. Kudos to you and your team. Of course, we had here Rodolfo as well, a co-author of the paper and member of the research team, uh, for really demonstrating where we are in terms of the state of the art of detecting corruption in the banking industry. And very much looking forward to what you and the rest of the team work on, and the paper that hopefully will follow soon.
Thanks a
Uh,
lot, Joseph. Yeah, it was a real pleasure. Thank you very much for all of your comments, and very precious. Thank you.
My pleasure. Um, and I would also like to thank everyone who joined the discussion today. Fabiano, of course. It's always lovely to have you. Fabiano also presented in a previous roundtable some time ago. And everyone else, of course, here for their contributions in the discussion and via chat. I look very much forward to see you all during the December roundtable that will be announced very soon as well. And let's see how the discussion on measuring of corruption progresses during 2026. Thank you, everyone.
Looking
Thanks a
forward.
lot.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.